Section 6 of Police. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Police by Robert W. Chambers. The Third Eye, Part 4. Toward midnight, I could hear the roar of breakers on our starboard bow. Evelyn heard them too, and sat up inquiringly. Gru has found the inlet to Black Bayou, I suppose, said I. And it proved to be the case, for, with the surf thundering on either hand, we sailed into a smoothly flowing inlet through which the flood tide was running between high dune, all sparkling in the moonlight and crowned with shadowy palms. Occasionally, I heard noises ahead of us from the other boat, as though Kemper was trying to converse with us. But as his apropos was as unintelligible as it was unopportune, I pretended not to hear him. Besides, I had all I could do to maneuver the tiller and prevent Evelyn Gray from falling off backward into the bayou. Besides, it is not customary to converse with the man at the helm. After a while, during which I seemed to distinguish in Kemper's voice a quality that rhymes with his name, his tone varied through phases, all the way from irony to exasperation. After a while, he gave it up and took to singing "There Was a Moon," and I suppose he thought he had a voice. It didn't strike me so. After several somewhat melancholy songs, he let off his pistol 2 or 3 times, and then subsided into silence. I didn't care. Neither his songs nor his shots interrupted, but let that pass, also. We were now sailing into the forest through pool after pool of interminable lagoons, startling into unseen and clattering flight hundreds of waterfowl. I could feel the wind from their whistling wings in the darkness as they drove by us out to sea. It seemed to startle the prey waitress. It is a solemn thing to be responsible for a pretty girl's peace of mind. I reassured her continually, perhaps a trifle nervously. But there were no more pistol shots. Perhaps Kemper had used up his cartridge. We were still drifting along under drooping sails, borne inland almost entirely by the tide. When the first pale, watery, grey light streaked the east, when it grew little lighter, Evelyn sat up. All danger of sharks being over. Also, I could begin to see what was going on in the other boat, which was nothing remarkable. Kemper slumped against the mast, his head turned in our direction. Gru sat at the helm motionless, his tattered straw hat sagging on his neck. When the sun rose, I called out cheerily to Kemper, asking him how he had passed the night. Evelyn also raised her head, pausing while bringing her disordered hair under discipline to listen to his reply. But he merely mumbled something. Perhaps he was still sleepy. As for me, I felt exceedingly well, and when Gru turned his craft inshore, I did so too. And when, under the overhanging foliage of the forest, the nose of my boat grated on the sand, I rose and crossed the deck with a step distinctly frolicsome. Kemper seemed distant and glum. Evelyn Gray spoke to him shyly now and then, and I noticed she looked at him only when he was gazing elsewhere than at her. She had a funny, conciliatory air with him, half ashamed, partly humorous and amused, as though something about Kemper's sulky ill-humor was continually making tiny inroads on her gravity. Some mullet had jumped into the 2 boats, half a dozen during our moonlight voyage, and these were now being fried with rice for us by Gru. Lord, how I hated to eat them. After we had finished breakfast, Gru, as usual, did everything to the remaining except to get into the fry pan with both feet, and as usual, he sickened me. When he'd cleaned up everything, I sent him off into the forest to find a dry shell mound for camping purposes. Then I made fast both boats, and Kemper and I carried ashore our paraphernalia: spare batterie de cuisine, firearm, fishing tackle, spares, harpoon, grains, oars, sails, spars, folding cage. Everything with which a strictly scientific expedition is usually burdened. Evelyn was washing her face in the crystal waters of a branch that flowed into the lagoon from under the live oaks. She looked very pretty doing it, like a naiad or a dryad, scrubbing away at her forest toilet. It was, in fact, such a pretty spectacle that I was going over to sit beside her while she did it. But Kemper started just when I was going to, and I turned away. Some men invariably do the wrong thing, but a handsome man doesn't last long with a pretty girl. I was thinking of this as I stood contemplating an alligator slide, when Gru came back saying that the shore on which we had landed was the termination of a shell mound, and that it was the only dry place he had found. So I bade him pitch our tents a few feet back from the shore, and stood watching him while he did so, one eye reverting occasionally to Evelyn Gray and Kemper. They both were seated cross-legged beside the branch, and they seemed to be talking a great deal and rather earnestly. I couldn't quite understand what they found to talk about so earnestly and volubly all of a sudden, inasmuch as they had heretofore exchanged very few observations during a most brief and formal acquaintance, dating only from sundown the day before. Gru set up our 3 tents, carried the luggage inland, and then hung about for a while until the vast shadow of a vulture swept across the trees. I never saw such an indescribable expression on a human face as I saw on Gru's as he looked up at the huge, unclean bird. His vitreous eyes fairly glittered, the corners of his mouth quivered and grew wet, and to my astonishment he seemed to emit a low, mewing noise. "What the devil are you doing?" I said impulsively, in my amazement and disgust. He looked at me, his eyes still glittering, the corners of his mouth still wet, but the curious sound had ceased. "What?" he asked. "Nothing. I thought you spoke." I didn't know what else to say. He made no reply. Once, when I had partially turned my head, I was aware that he was warily turning his to look at the vulture, which has alighted heavily on the ground near the entrails and heads of the mullet, where he had cast them on the dead leaves. I walked over to where Evelyn Gray and Kemper sat so busily conversing, and their volubility ceased as they glanced up and saw me approaching, which phenomenon both perplexed and displeased me. I said, "This is the Black Bayou Forest, and we have the most serious business of our lives before us. Suppose you and I start out, Kemper, and see if there are any traces of what we were after in the neighborhood of our camp." "Do you think it's safe to leave Miss Gray alone in the camp?" he asked gravely. I hadn't thought of that. "No, of course not," I said. "Gru can stay." "I don't need anybody," she said quickly. "Anyway, I'm rather afraid of Gru." "Afraid of Gru?" I repeated. "Not exactly afraid, but he's unpleasant." "I'll remain with Miss Gray," said Kemper politely. "Oh!" she exclaimed. "I couldn't ask that. It is true that I feel a little tired and nervous, but I can go with you and Mr. Smith and Gru." I surveyed Kemper in cold perplexity. As chief of the expedition, I couldn't very well offer to remain with Evelyn Gray, but I didn't propose that Kemper should either. "Take Gru," he suggested, "and look about the woods for a while. Perhaps after dinner Miss Gray may feel sufficiently rested to join us." "I am sure," she said, "that a few hour rest in camp will set me on my feet. All I need is rest. I didn't sleep very soundly last night." I felt myself growing red, and I looked away from them. "Oh," said Kemper, in apparent surprise. "I thought you had slept soundly all night long." "Nobody," said I, "could have slept very pleasantly during that musical performance of yours." "Were you singing?" she asked innocently of Kemper. "He was singing when he wasn't firing off his pistol," I remarked. "No wonder you couldn't sleep with any satisfaction to yourself." Gru had disappeared into the forest. I stood watching for him to come out again. After a few minutes, I heard a furious but distant noise of flapping. The others also heard it, and we listened in silence, wondering what it was. "It's Gru killing something," faltered Evelyn Gray, turning a trifle pale. "Confound it!" I exclaimed. "I'm going to stop that right now." Kemper rose and followed me as I started for the woods. But as we passed the beached boats, Gru appeared from among the trees. "Where have you been?" I demanded. "In the woods." "Doing what?" "Nothing." There was a bit of down here and there clinging to his cotton shirt and trousers, and one had caught and stuck at the corner of his mouth. "See here, Gru," I said. "I don't want you to kill any birds except for camp purposes. Why do you try to catch and kill birds?" "I don't." I stared at the man, and he stared back at me, out of his glassy eyes. "You mean to say that you don't, somehow or other, manage to catch and kill birds?" "No, I don't." There was nothing further for me to say unless I gave him the lie. I didn't care to do that, needing his services. Evelyn Gray had come up to join us. There was a brief silence. We all stood looking at Gru, and he looked back at us out of his pale, washed out, and unblinking eyes. "Gru," I said, "I haven't yet explained to you the objects of this expedition to Black Bayou. Now, I'll tell you what I want. But first, let me ask you a question or two. You know the Black Bayou forests, don't you?" "Yes." "Did you ever see anything unusual in these forests?" "No." "Are you sure?" The man stared at us one after another, then he said, "What are you looking for in Black Bayou?" "Something very curious, very strange, very unusual. So strange and unusual, in fact, that the great Zoological Society of the Bronx in New York has sent me down here at the head of this expedition to search the forest of Black Bayou." "For what?" he demanded in a dull, accentless voice. "For a totally new species of human being. Gru, I wish to catch one and take it back to New York in the folding cage." His green eyes had grown narrow as though sun-dazzled. Kemper had stepped behind us into the woods and was now busy setting up the folding cage. Gru remained motionless. "I am going to offer you," I said, "the sum of $1,000 in gold if you can guide us to a spot where we may see this hitherto unknown species, a creature which is apparently a man but which has, in the back of his head, a third eye." I paused in amazement. Gru's cheeks had suddenly puffed out and were quivering, and from the corners of his slittered mouth he was emitting a whimpering sound like the noise made by a low circling pigeon. "Gru!" I cried. "What's the matter with you?" "What is he doing?" screamed Gru, quivering from head to foot, but not turning around. "Who?" I cried. "The man behind me." "Professor Kemper? He's setting up the folding cage." With a screech that raised my hair, Gru whipped out his murderous knife and hurled himself backward at Kemper, but the latter shrank aside behind the partially erect cage, and Gru whirled around, snarling, hacking, and even biting at the wood frame and steel bars. And then occurred a thing so horrid that it sickened me to the pit of my stomach, for the man's sagging straw hat had fallen off, and there, in the back of his head, through the coarse, black, ratty hair, I saw a glassy eye glaring at me. "Kemper!" I shouted. "He's got a third eye! He's one of them! Knock him flat with your rifle stock!" And I seized a shotgun from the top of the bagage bundle on the ground beside me and leaped at Gru, aiming a terrific blow at him. But the glassy eye in the back of his head was watching me between the clotted strands of hair, and he dodged both Kemper and me, swinging his heavy knife in circles and glaring at us both out of the front and back of his head. Kemper seized him by his arm, but Gru's shirt came off, and I saw his entire body was as furry as an ape's, and all the while he was snapping at us and leaping hither and thither to avoid our blows, and from the corners of his puffed cheeks he whined and whimpered and mewed through the saliva foam. "Keep him from the water," I panted, following him with clubbed shotgun, and as I advanced I almost stepped on a soiled heap of fullness, the dead buzzard which he had caught and worried to death with his teeth. Suddenly he threw his knife at my head, hurling it backward, dodged, screeched, and bounded by me toward the shore of the lagoon, where the pretty waitress was standing, petrified. For one moment I thought he had her, but she picked up her skirts, ran for the nearest boat, and seized the harpoon, and in his fierce eagerness to catch her, he leaped clear over the boat and fell with a splash into the lagoon. As Kemper and I sprang aboard and looked over into the water, we could see him going down out of reach of a harpoon, and his body seemed to be silver plated, flashing and glittering like a burnished eel. So completely did the skin of air envelop him, held there by the fur that covered him. And as he rested for a moment on the bottom, deep down through the clear waters of the lagoon where he lay prone, I could see, as the current stirred his long black hair, the third eye looking up at us, glassy, unwinking, horrible. A bubble or two, like globules of quicksilver, were detached from the burnished skin of air that clothed him, and came glittering upward. Suddenly there was a flash, a flurrying cloud of blue mud, and Gru was gone. After a long while, I turned around in the muteness of my despair, and slowly froze. For the pretty waitress, becomingly pale, was gathered in Kemper's arms, her cheeks against his shoulder. Neither seemed to be aware of me. "Darling," he said, in the imbecile voice of a man in love, "why do you tremble so when I am here to protect you? Don't you love and trust me?" "Oh, yes," she sighed, pressing her cheek closer to his shoulder. I shoved my hands into my pockets, passed them without noticing them, and stepped ashore. And there I sat down under a tree, with my back toward them, all alone and face to face with the greatest grief of my life. But which it was, the loss of her or the loss of Gru, I had not yet made up my mind. End of section 6. Recorded by Isam.